Today on The Science of Creativity, I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. Liane Gabora. She's one of the most interdisciplinary thinkers in creativity research. Our conversation ranges really widely, from computational models of cultural evolution to her honing theory of creativity. Her research explores how ideas emerge, how they evolve, how they reshape the mind itself. This conversation really takes us deep into how creativity works, from neural networks to human culture. I'm here with Liane Gabora. Liane, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here.
You've done so much research on creativity that I had trouble preparing for the interview for my questions because I had, 3 hours of questions to ask. What would you say is there a single thread that runs through all of your research? What would you say is, the tagline for Professor Gabora?
Yes, there absolutely is. So some people have told me that I seem to dabble in a lot of different disciplines, but in fact, all along, I've just been pursuing the same line of questioning. And if that took me into what society deems as a different discipline, I didn't worry too much about that. I just followed the same line of questioning. And it all started with the question, how does culture evolve? Because I actually started out not as a psychology graduate student, but as a graduate student in biology in an artificial life program. And I developed a computer model of how natural selection works. And then I found out very quickly that someone else had already done the same thing 15 years earlier, and John Holland, and he'd applied it to all kinds of things like optimizing pipeline configurations and stuff like that.
Right, sure.
But what I thought, okay, well, I wasn't the first person to do that, but nobody's ever developed a computer model of cultural evolution, how culture evolves. And so I was the first person to develop a computer model of cumulative cultural evolution. And I had these agent-based neural networks, and they represented individuals. And every iteration, they could just do one of two things. They could either invent a new idea, or they could imitate what one of their neighbors is doing. And just through this interleaving of invention and imitation, I got this nice building of fitter and fitter ideas across the artificial society as a whole. So that's kind of what got me started. But then, well, I'd kind of always been told I was creative. So I was always curious, what does that mean? So I was already interested in creativity, but I realized that the weakest part of that computer model was that the agents weren't being creative in a way that seemed very human-like. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll just have to delve into the creativity literature for a few months and see what that's all about so that I can develop this creativity algorithm more realistically. And 25 years later, I'm still studying creativity because it's such a vast and fascinating and complex field that, as you well know, Keith, that, it's one question leads to another. And I'm really excited that my career went that direction.
I'd like to dive into that a little bit deeper. I was there too in the 1990s when artificial life and agent-based modeling were first starting, and you were just way ahead of the curve because that area of research has just grown and grown in the past 25 years. So could you say a little bit more about that for listeners who haven't heard of artificial life or agents? What is that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the neural network-based agents that I was using almost 30 years ago now were very, very primitive. They were inspired by sort of the whole PDP, Rumelhart and McClelland parallel distributed processing book that I think it dates in 1986. And there was a little bit of a spurt of interest in these new methods that could get human-like behavior out of these distributed systems. And a lot of them were sub-symbolic. So there was this whole symbolic AI that represented symbols as nodes and then sort of did what would sort of seem logical to do as a first try. And this was very different from that. It was kind of emergent computation. And then, what was happening under the hood wasn't, very explicitly obvious, right? But since then, there's been some big explosions in what's happened with AI. I guess 2012 was a big step. And then 2017 was another big step where they realized that you actually have to pay attention to, you have to put attention into the model. So not only can you have activation spreading through a network and have these sort of learning systems that are modifying the output of that process based on how much it differs from what you want it to be. But you also have to have each component of the input paying attention to the other components of the input. And so each component of the input is considered in the context of the rest of the input. And that was a huge breakthrough, and also just scaling up, just putting vast amounts of compute at these things has led to the progress that we have now. I have an interesting story about that, actually. For years in my psychology of creativity class, I would give the students this exercise where I would ask them to invent words that don't mean anything, and then invent what their meanings would be if they did mean something. So invent word meaning pairs that feel right. And then they would have to turn to their partner, the person sitting next to them, and then they would, in a random order, give them I would ask them to do between 3 and 5 of these word meaning pairs. And so give them the words and give them the meanings and see if they can guess which meaning goes with which word. And of course, if things function as the way that symbolic AI works, they wouldn't be able to get any of these right because they don't mean anything. But in fact, almost inevitably, they would get them all right. And I would use that exercise as a prelude to explaining the distributed nature of human memory and the role that that plays in our creative process. So I was having them do that year after year. And then just last year, I thought, maybe it was 2 years ago now, I bet LLMs could do pretty well at that. And so I gave them the same task. So I asked the LLM to invent words and then invent what that word would mean if it meant something. And then I had a graduate student, Marina Wang, who helped me out with this part of it. She gave Claude all of the word meaning pairs that ChatGPT had invented, and she gave ChatGPT all of the word meaning pairs that Claude had invented. And they got almost all of them right. So ChatGPT got 20 of Claude's right, and Claude got 18 of ChatGPT's right. So what was funny is that I had been using this exercise for maybe 10 years as a way of explaining how human memory is different from the memory of a conventional computer. And now we were in a situation where computers can actually do exactly this exercise that I had invented for the purpose of showing how different humans are from computers. So that's where we are now. And of course, they're still not up to par. I mean, I wouldn't want to read a novel that was composed by ChatGPT, for example. Gemini would probably write the best novel. But nonetheless, it's really impressive that they can get this particular exercise right. I could go on and talk about that more, but I'll let you take the floor.
Oh, there's so many questions I have about that because, like I said, I was there. You think a lot of the same ways I do. I've always been fascinated by distributed cognition and by multi-agent systems. And I published a paper called Artificial Societies. I think it was in 2001. So, but I'll pause for a minute and say, what does that have to do with creativity? Would you say that was a creativity study?
Oh, absolutely. So to invent words and invent meanings for them that feel right is the kind of ability that you see in advertising, for example, which is definitely a creative endeavor. It's what you see when people invent stage names and pen names. So often they pick names that have a ring to them, but also that give you the feeling of what you want to convey. So, for example, if it's a speculative or science fiction novelist, you want that name to have that sort of weird, far out vibe, right? And if it's a comedian who just does funny skits that are palatable to children as well as adults, you want them to have a playful kind of sounding name, right? Or if it's a porn star, that's yet another sound of name, right? So, and inventing business names and yeah, this comes up all over the place. This ability to match sounds with names.
Well, my wife and I actually play a game. It's not really a game, but it's band names just through everyday life, or we're watching a television show, or we're having a conversation. And every now and then one of us will say 2 or 3 words together that sound like it might be a good band name.
Oh,
and the other
great.
one will say band name, good band name. We have actually a list of these that we put on the bulletin board. So it's, I don't know it, right?
Oh,
It's
that's
something
so
that
fun.
sounds like a porn star, or it sounds
Right.
like, but that is a shared kind of cultural understanding of people who speak the same language and they share the same culture, right? You need to have a lot that's shared between people before you're going to understand that.
Yes, it probably doesn't work as well with people who, so for example, if it's in English, if English is their second language, because they don't have that history of associating sounds with words. And yet some of it though, I think is more cross-cultural. So for example, there are certain sounds that have a very sharp sound to them, whereas words that have like double O's in them will sound more like for example, I have a colleague who was making this point in a paper, and he used the example of flug blogs. And then this is where this exercise actually came from, was Bob French's paper. It was written back in 1990s. But he says, does flug blogs mean a new kind of thing? I can't remember what all the options were, but one of them was a new kind of shoe that you walk on water with. And of course, everybody guesses that it means that, because it just sounds, those O's and those G's have these round sounds that feel like walking on water for some reason. So some of it was related to symbolic and meanings, but part of it's just related to the sounds of the words.
You've talked about the mechanisms underlying creativity. So if we're looking at, or we're thinking about that kind of creativity, what goes on in the mind when people are being creative in that way? Or anyway, that's a big aspect of your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I've been developing for quite a while now is something I refer to as the honing theory of creativity. And there are a bunch of many aspects to the theory. One of them is that it's the shape of your worldview that guides the creative process. And it isn't a domain-specific event in the sense that you are using whatever you have at your disposal to serve as ingredients for your creative processing, metabolizing. I like to use that word. And so some of the experiments that we've been carrying out in my lab to show that your mind is actually using whatever it has at its disposal as ingredients. And it's doing that because it wants to restructure itself, because the mind as a whole is a self-organizing system. It's trying to maintain a coherence and to deal with or process things that are unresolved. And through that, its overall configuration changes because the whole thing is interconnected. And just like if you take a hammer and crack some ice, well, that hammer will, or even better, if you drop a stone in a pond, well, the ripples will spread all throughout the pond. And it could be that there's a stone dropped on the other side of the pond, and it is spreading ripples as well. And then you get ways in which those ripples, they actually superpose on one another and reinforce one another. So you get unpredictable things that are happening that could be far away from the source of the original stone. And similarly in the mind, everything that you do affects directly or indirectly, to maybe a smaller degree, possibly a larger degree, every other aspect of your worldview, your mental model of the world. So one of the kinds of experiments that we've tried to show is that there's a lot of focus in the creativity literature on the outputs of the creative process. And in order to produce an output that is deemed highly creative, you have to have a lot of training in the tools of that craft. And people say that you need, 10 years of experience or 10,000 hours. And so that means that blocks people from making great contributions in multiple domains. And from that kind of result, people have said that the creative process is domain specific. But what if you look at not the outputs to the creative process, but the inputs? So that's one of the experiments that we've done. For example, we've asked people to list all of the things that they've created that they are proud of. And then we ask them, for each one of those things that you've created, list as many or as few inspirational inputs or sources of inspiration that triggered or inspired that creative work. And we would have been happy just to get, 5 or 10 or 15% of the inspirational sources to their creative works be from other domains. In fact, it was the vast majority of the inspirational sources came from other domains, and they came from all over the people's lives. And so what that tells you is that, maybe if you just look at the outputs to the creative process, it looks like it's all domain specific. But if you look at the inputs, what the person's doing when they're creating, they're taking things from all aspects of their existence and metabolizing, working them through, and then only at the end of that stage do they squeeze them through the filters, the constraints that allow them to be expressed as a work of music, for example, or as a work of art.
Right. I think you call that, from what I've read of yours, cross-domain thinking, that it's a very old finding in creativity research, is that if you combine two things that are different from each other or very different from each other, they're more likely to be a creative combination. And here you're talking about, seems like something very similar, right?
Yeah, and another prediction that comes from this is that creativity can be therapeutic. It can solidify your sense of who you are. It can enhance your sense of well-being. Most theories of creativity, they wouldn't predict that. There's no reason, given that theory, for creativity to be therapeutic. But if creativity really is altering and changing your worldview, your mental model of reality, well, then of course it would be therapeutic, because it is finding, and especially if you take the view that the mind is a second level of self-organizing, self-mending structure, as I do. So then of course it's therapeutic, because you're mending yourself. You're taking these things that maybe have been suppressed, they're too painful to deal with directly, and you find these little backdoor entrances to these suppressed memories, to these painful things, and by turning them into a song or turning them into a novel that's maybe about other people, but still the emotions behind those experiences are getting expressed, getting worked through the process of creating that work, then you are becoming a different person. You're becoming somebody who is more integrated and who can more fully know who they are. And so that's another prediction that comes out of the theory as well.
Would you say the self-organizing processes that go on in the mind, do they always move forward in a positive way? It sounds like you're saying that creativity, or at least the self-organizing processes of the mind, would always lead in a positive direction.
Well, a word like positive always assumes with respect to something. You can only be positive with respect to something. And so oftentimes something seems positive with respect to one thing, but there's something much more important that you should be taking into account, right? So something might be positive in the sense that it's expressing something in the moment that you're feeling, and it's providing an outlet for that thing, but it can be negative in the sense that this isn't the moment to express that thing, right? So yeah, I just like to caution, these value judgments, they always assume some kind of yardstick, right?
Oh, right. But you used the word therapeutic, that it was going to be a therapeutic process.
Okay, yeah. So therapeutic, yeah, I mean, adaptive for the individual. So they are feeling maybe more at ease or more at peace or have a more solid sense of who they are, that kind of thing.
Okay. And that's my belief too. I think creativity really is a positive force, and that when people are engaged in creative action, for example, one finding is that they're more likely to be in this flow state of peak experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something that can lead to these altered states of awareness and states that actually change who you are inside, who you feel you are, for sure.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment, because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. It's making me think of a quotation I wrote down on my notes from your website. And here's your quotation: midway through the creative process, one's mind is in a potentiality state. I love that. So what is that, the potentiality state, and what does it mean that you're midway through creativity?
Okay. So there's this problem that people were wrestling with in the late 80s in psychology about how to model what happens when concepts combine. Because we had lots of mathematical models that could predict theories that could predict what happens in a lab when people are just asked to classify something as an instance of one concept or one category or another category. But in terms of what they do with combined concepts, all bets were off. We couldn't come up with a theory that would match what happens when people combine concepts. And people tried all kinds of things like fuzzy logic, all kinds of things. So I came up with this weird idea that you could model concept combinations as superposition states. And long story short, I did my PhD with somebody whose own PhD was in quantum mechanics. He was actually in the math department. So my PhD officially was in math, but really it was cognitive science. But what we did was we used the mathematics of, so generalizations of this mathematics, and then applied them to modeling what happens with concept combinations. And we were really successful. And there is now a whole field that is devoted to applying the mathematics from quantum mechanics to cognition. It's called quantum cognition, and there's been a whole bunch of special issues, and there's an annual conference. And so that's what got me started. But quantum mechanics deals a lot with states of potentiality. And when something is not being measured, so if you've got a quantum particle and it's not being measured, you have no way of knowing something about this particle unless you do a measurement of it. But any measurement that you make will change the state of that particle. And weird things happen when particles come together. They enter these weird states that are called entangled states. And so there's all these weird things that are going on where anything you do to one affects the other, anything you do to the other affects the first one, even if they're on other sides of the universe. So there were these weird things going on. And it turned out that this same mathematics could capture a lot of interesting things that were going on with describing how concepts interact with each other in ways that could make accurate predictions about how people deal with concept combinations. So in so doing, I got to really understand that for any concept, there exists some potential context in which even the most defining features of that concept would be irrelevant. And so an example that I like to use is kitchen island, because if ever there were a defining feature of a concept, it would be the feature surrounded by water for the concept island. But if your kitchen island is surrounded by water, then you're in trouble, right? So in the context kitchen, the concept island loses even its seemingly most defining feature. And so you can think of every single concept as having the potentiality to acquire all kinds of different states in all the different contexts that they could find themselves in. And I think this is what lies at the heart of our capacity to be creative, is to allow our minds to enter this state where we are bathing in that potentiality. We're open to that potentiality. We're not considering concepts in their most canonical, fixed, conventional states. So considering the concept island as in tropical island, we're allowing our minds to think of a concept in such a way that it has the ability to easily lose properties, like in the kitchen island example, or easily gain new properties. So for example, if you think of the concept bunny, it has an eyes and it has a heart. But if you think chocolate bunny, then it no longer has a heart, but it acquires this new property of being edible, right? So if you're thinking of I guess people do eat bunnies, but you get what the point I mean.
Right, sure.
So there is a way to hold your mind in a state of openness towards this potentiality that exists at the level of individual concepts, but it also exists at the level of clumps of concepts, and in fact, at the level of your mind as a whole, right? And so I think that's what we're doing when we be creative. We're capitalizing on that kind of potentiality.
Yeah, it seems like a combination like Kitchen Island, I would say, is more creative than a combination like Tropical Island or like Kitchen Sink. It sounds like that's what you're getting at when you talk about the potentiality. It's, I don't know, what would you say, distant, or I don't know how to say other than creative.
Yeah. I guess people have used the word remote as in remote associates, right? It's definitely related to that.
Right. And that type of conceptual combination, and at least the research I'm familiar with is that those combinations are more likely to be creative. So does your research support that kind of combination involves more creative processes in the mind?
Yes, absolutely. So we've actually worked on a little mathematical model that shows that we could show that as you shift to allowing for more and more unusual contexts, the exemplars of something that come to mind become more creative. So for example, if the concept is hat and you only consider it in a simple context like baseball game, then baseball hat comes to mind, right? But if you allow more and more unconventional contexts, then things like pylon, like using a pylon as a hat, will come to mind. And so we did that. We did a study on that with human participants, and then we built this little mathematical model that captured what actually went on in the study.
Yeah, I'm catching a theme in your whole career is the mathematical modeling or the computational modeling, going all the way back to the 1990s when really almost no one was doing this. So what does that add? So let's say for the rest of us, the people that aren't researchers, how does your research give us insights into creativity in our everyday lives?
Well, it hasn't all been about formal modeling. I've done a bunch of work that is on the evolution of creativity as well. So this is something that many lay people find interesting, is just this question of how we became so creative. So the earliest signs of creativity it keeps getting pushed back. I mean, we keep finding earlier and earlier tools, right? So now it's actually pushed back like a couple million years. Crazy, eh? That the earliest stone tools, the earliest sort of insights that happened in people's minds were several million years ago. I mean, I like to ask my students to really think what that would be like. So we're surrounded by things that began as a spark of inspiration in somebody's mind. And most times we'll never meet the person who had that idea, right? But their insights are touching our lives and affecting our lives nevertheless. And so just everywhere we look, we're surrounded by things that began as a little spark of inspiration in someone's mind. But if you really think back to what it would have been like millions of years ago, where there was just stuff that was the result of geological processes or biological processes, but nothing yet was the result of cultural processes, then for the first person who invented a stone tool, and it started out as an idea in their mind, and then by carefully like scraping one stone against another, they were able to come up with that something was sharp enough to be useful. Like that would have seemed totally magical. So I love putting people in the perspective of that. But so one of the things that we've been doing is we've been trying to corroborate evidence from anthropology, changes in the size of skulls, evidence from archaeology, so tools and other things that were left around by our ancestors, evidence from neuroscience, and even some genetic evidence, so like what gene changes came online at what times, as well as computational modeling. So to corroborate and put together a picture of how did the capacity to be creative evolve over time. And so long story short is that the picture that seems to be coming into place is that what happened initially, maybe around that period of a million or more years ago, was that we acquired the ability that our memories were dense. So there was an increase in the brain size at that time. So the cranial capacity, anyways, we can extrapolate. Like if the cranium is bigger, then the brain's probably bigger, and so the brains probably had more neurons devoted to the encoding of any one thing. And so that meant that the mental representations in the mind could overlap more because they were each one was encoded in more details. So if you are picking up this same rock and you notice that it's heavy, but a million years later, you pick up the same rock and the person notices, oh, not only is it heavy, but it's also very smooth and it's also very white and it's sparkly. So for anything that you encountered, you're encoding it in more detail. And so then your mental representations would overlap more. And then the more they overlap, the more pathways there are for one thing to evoke a reminding of another. And then once you had the ability to evoke remindings of other things, then you could use that to recursively operate on the outputs of any one thought and use that as inputs into the next thought. So you could engage in a stream of thought. You could escape the here and now and go into imagining about the future. So what you might produce if you kept on scraping away at this rock, you might produce something useful. Or you could even reimagine the past. And so that was the beginning of storytelling. We weren't yet able to speak with grammatically correct language, but we probably could act things out. So last night I was chased by this wild boar or whatever, and you acted out by the campfire for the other people, right? So that was the beginnings of being able to escape the here and now and to use one thought as input to the next thought and thereby engage in a stream of thought. But you're still pretty limited, I think, in what you could counter. I mean, we're really limited by what the archaeological evidence is. A lot of it disintegrates, right? We have no evidence of the songs people were singing or the dances that they were dancing. But we do know that there was around a million or, almost 1.5 million years of just stasis where they were basically using the same hand axe over and over again without a lot of innovation. And then around 100,000 years ago, there was, archaeologists, they debate one another a lot. So it was first called the Big Bang of human creativity. But then people say, oh, there was no Big Bang. It happened much more slowly if you consider not only the European archaeological record, but also the African archaeological record. But anyways, however slowly or quickly it happened, it did happen. And so now you have, within a fairly short time span, you have the beginnings of all kinds of signs of creativity. So musical instruments and burial of the dead with valuable objects, which means that there is probably religious thought going on there. You see not just these hand acts, but you see all kinds of tools that were for specific tasks. So one tool is for this task and another tool is for that task. And you see lots of beads and jewelry and all kinds of signs of creativity. And so we think what came online then was the onset of the capacity to shift between different modes of thought. So you could have a certain, default mode of thought where you were just doing the next thing that you had to do in order to get the task done. And then if you were stumped and you had a problem to solve, then you would shift to a more divergent mode of thought, find that unconventional solution in that divergent mode of thought. And so you would basically acquire the ability to tailor your mode of thought to the particular situation that you were in at that moment. And so we've done things, going back to the computer models, we've done things like simulating in these agent-based models. Well, if you do give these agents the capacity to first go more quickly from one thought to another thought, so this capacity to engage in a stream of thought or chaining, and then you give them the capacity, then you do get an increase in the overall fitness of the ideas across this artificial society. You also get an increase in the diversity of ideas across society. But then if you, on top of that, give them the ability to shift depending on the problem they're encountering between different processing modes. So simulating the capacity for what I've called contextual focus, or the ability to shift between divergent and convergent thought. Well, then you get this explosion of increased fitness in the ideas across the society as a whole. So once again, support for this general theory that these two steps can be accounted for by these two underlying cognitive changes. And, the story may change, but that's our best guess at this point.
Right. Yeah, it is fascinating. And I can see why it takes an interdisciplinary approach, because in what you were just saying, you're kind of switching back and forth between the individual level, and then you jump up to the cultural level and you talk about cultural evolution, and then you talk about how cognitive mechanisms drive cultural evolution. And that's really the way I think about your career, is that interdisciplinary combination to the evolution of culture.
Yeah, I haven't done it on my own. Part of the reason why I've been able to cross these disciplines is because I've found wonderful collaborators who work with me on these different projects. And it's a struggle to work across disciplines, because the same word can mean something very different in different disciplines. And because what sounds so sensible to you, this person from this other discipline will look at it and say, "Oh my gosh, you can't say that. It will be rejected out of hand." So yeah, just the culture and word choice and so on are so different. But once you overcome these initial hurdles, and it can take a while, it can take months, it's so exciting. And the disciplines are arbitrarily carved up, right? We carved up human knowledge into these different disciplines as a tool for just, allowing us to divide up knowledge into classes that would be taught in different, by different people or whatever. But it is pretty arbitrary. And I think we've really delved to the bottoms of these disciplines, of the core of these disciplines. And I think the really interesting things that are left to do lie at the boundary lines or in frontiers between these different disciplines. And so I think it's an exciting place to do research right now.
It's cross-domain thinking.
Yes, it is.
In the academic world. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we're nearing the end of our time. I always like to end by asking if you have some practical advice or some sort of tip or exercise that listeners could do in the next week that might enhance their creativity.
Well, a first thing I would say is, if you feel that you aren't creative, don't sweat it, because not everyone should. I believe everyone is potentially creative and has the capacity to be creative. But if you feel that you're not creative in any major big way, then that's totally fine. One of the things that I've done with my computer models is that I've shown that society actually does best when you have a mix of these more creative types and these less creative types, because then you have a nice balance. Like any evolutionary process, whether it be cultural or biological, you need a balance between creativity and continuity. You need for the solutions that work to be perpetuated, and you need to inject novelty, especially if the environment's changing, so that those existing solutions can be even better. You need a nice balance of that. So I think there is a kind of wisdom. I think people decide at some subconscious level how creative that they should be. And I think there's a wisdom behind that, and to respect that inner wisdom that's guiding you. But I do want to answer the question, because I think in the lives of every person, there are moments where you are given a bunch of choices. It could be a multiple choice test, or it could just be where it's obvious that somebody is offering you that you can either do this or that. And where the right thing to do in that moment is to take a step back and think, none of the choices I'm being given is actually the best thing for me to do right now. And so I tell all my psychology of creativity students that look out in your life for those little moments where the choices that you're being offered don't feel right at some gut level, and think about something that isn't one of those choices and offer that up as an alternative. And to drive this point home for my students, I give them a question on their midterm, and I say, answer the following in an accurate and transformational creative manner and explain your answer. So the best explanation for Walt Disney's creativity is A, it was inspired by sexual relationships with exotic farm animals. B, he smoked too much pot. C, he was plagiarizing the work of an obscure Russian folk artist. Or D, he was channeling the soul of a deceased mouse. And so transformational creativity, it entails altering the rules of the conceptual space to go beyond what was thought possible. And so none of the answers that I give are accurate. And in fact, they're all completely ridiculous. So the only way to get full marks on that question is to come up with anything that isn't A, B, C, or D. And so every year I get some really hilarious answers to that question. But every year I get a few students who just give me one of A, B, C, or D, because by the time they come to me, they've been so brainwashed into filling in, just right. Choosing from amongst the options that they've been given, right? So look for those moments where the best way to go is not one of the options you've been given.
Well, thank you so much. That is great advice. And Dr. Liane Gabora, thanks for joining me today.
All right. Thank you, Keith. It's been real fun.
That was my conversation with Dr. Liane Gabora. We explored creativity as a self-organizing process. It reshapes both ideas and identities. We discussed cultural evolution, potentiality, and why creativity is often about changing the question rather than choosing an answer. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share it with someone you know who likes creativity, and join me next time on The Science of Creativity on YouTube or on any podcast platform. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.